folks, welcome back to Recently Seen Reading. I'm Heather, and there's no way that you've seen me recently since I've kind of been absent from BookTube. Nothing dramatic has caused the absence, and all is well here. I had a rather prolonged stretch of kind of a reading slump for me. I was getting lots of reading done, but wasn't enjoying a lot of it, and I picked up a number of novels that were by first-time novelists, and they had a lot of the flaws that first-time novels often have, and some local histories, which had all of the problems that local history can sometimes have, things like lack of footnotes, incomplete bibliographies, lack of a critical eye on their material. So a little bit of a slump, and then bam, we're in the midst of the current situation. So the part of Canada I live in currently has a relatively low number of cases, and our public health officers here started to close things up around the 10th of March. Things started to change here. And that's the day I went to pick up my copy of Hilary Mantel's latest novel. And that's the day when things started to change for us here. Everything here is pretty calm, I would say. We're not to the phase where we have community transmission, but a lot of things are closed. The public libraries closed, the universities all closed up and moved to online teaching. The public schools are all closed. The public library has just announced that it's going to be closed for an additional 3 or 4 weeks. And these are all good things. Our transit system has shifted to ensure that people board the buses from the back, which protects the drivers. Our grocery stores have installed plexiglass shields between the cashier and the customer, which is one way of protecting the grocery store workers, so that's great. I can tell from looking out my window, which overlooks a couple of the busy streets here, that traffic is way down. It's well below what it would be in summer. It's what it would be maybe around Christmas time, and that's all to the good. So things are fine here. I'm relieved to be able to say that right now, but like everybody else, I'm worried. And maybe more than worried, I'm distracted and finding it difficult to read in a sustained fashion. I think this is a pretty common reaction to their current situation. All of our executive functions are overtly challenged right now. An executive function is the thing that psychologically helps us go from task A to task B to task C without thinking about it and knowing what our next task is. It's often the thing that goes with people early, with people with dementia, and it can be quite startling when you realize that you walked from one room into the other room and you've forgotten entirely what you were moving from place A to place B for. Women going through menopause experience this as well. It's the kind of brain fog that happens as part of that biological process. So executive functions are all challenged. It's much harder to pay attention to things. It's much easier to become distracted. So I'm trying to have patience with myself around that. It's frustrating, but it'll pass, I'm hoping, for me. And if that's the worst of it, that will be amazing. So January was an okay reading month for me. There were some good things in February in my reading. I'm going to just check my notes here. Can I remember anything? No. Executive function. It's a little overworked right now. I think the standouts for me, I've got, say, 3 that I would recommend. And 2 titles are likely to be familiar to you if you've been watching folks on BookTube at all. One is Carmen Machado's memoir, In the Dream House. It was great. The content is what you hear people talk about the most, that it's a memoir of her time in a relationship in which there was a lot of, over time, assault, and domestic assault and domestic abuse inside a same-sex relationship. And that's an attention-grabbing and compelling kind of account, because we tend not to see that talked about in public very much. But the thing that interested me in Machado's book beyond how good the writing is how interesting the structure is. It's set up with all of these short chapters, and each chapter includes multiple, if I'm remembering it correctly, multiple footnotes to essentially folklore motif indexes, in which Machado is playing off the motif index against events in her own life. So she's using this apparatus from the study of folklore and fairy tales to help structure the memoir. It helps her get past the kind of standard chronology we use often when building memoirs. It's what makes her memoir so compelling. The second one I'd recommend and I enjoyed a great deal in February was Mira Jacobs' Good Talk, and you'll have heard people mention this, and it also has a similarly compelling story. It's not about domestic assault, but it's about the difficulties in explaining racism to one's child. So quite well done as a graphic novel. And what I found was most interesting about it is how Jacobs uses photographs to stand in as the background of all of the page designs, and very simple black and white line drawings for the figures and speech bubbles. So it allows someone to tell a story in a graphic novel form without having particularly sophisticated drawing skills. And I thought that was an interesting approach. And I think there's something interesting going on with the simplicity of the foreground of black and white figures and the complexity of the background pictures that helps strengthen and deepen the significance of the conversation she's having, most often with her young son. So that one I thought was great as a graphic novel or graphic memoir. And the third I'd recommend, especially if you have read In the Dream House and are interested in the kinds of issues it brings up around sexual assault and domestic assault and domestic abuse inside gay and lesbian and queer communities. That's Cheng Thom's essay collection, which came out in September of 2019. It's called I Hope We Choose Love, a Trans Girl's Notes at the End of the World. And I read this one about a month and a half ago, and Thom writes children's fiction, poetry, essays, some fiction for adults as well. Has really interesting things to say about what communities do and don't do when faced with difficult subjects and faced with bad behaviors within communities and between communities. And it's a strong voice for not choosing punitive methods of dealing with conflict. Well written, interestingly structured, so it's got essays, often very personal essays, separated by pieces of poetry. I think if you liked Machado and you liked Sarah Schumann's Conflict is Not Abuse, you'll probably like the Thom. It may be tricky to get a hold of. It's published by Arsenal Pulp Press, which is a Vancouver-based press that publishes lots of alternative, left-of-center fiction and poetry and nonfiction. But I would recommend Thom. Interesting voice, an interesting way of looking at the world. And the message, I hope we choose love, I think is great for this time in our lives. So what am I reading now between being distracted by my overactive executive function and the ease with which all the bad news flows to us? Better if the good news flowed to us more quickly, wouldn't it? Not possible, I suppose, right now. So I'm reading Mantell's Mira and the Light, but it's slow going for me. I'm not gulping it down the way I gulped down the first two volumes of the trilogy. And I think that's a good thing. It's buying the book kind of marks the moment for me in which things changed in my immediate environment. And it's a beautifully written book, and since I'm reading it fairly slowly for me, I'm noticing more of the nuance in the writing and the imagery. And what still fascinates me about Mantell's approach is, for a historical novel, how it refuses chronological progression, absolutely refuses it. how there's constantly looping back into the past, usually with the immediate past, or in Cromwell's past. It's a fascinating and odd technique for a historical novelist to take, so well worth paying attention to, I think. The other thing I'm about to finish up is a reread of some Dorothy Sayers. I'm rereading A Natural Death, which I read years and years ago. It's the third novel in her Peter Wimsey series. And while I'm enjoying the kind of foolishness of the language and the punning and the complexity of the language, and Peter Wimsey as a character with Peter Parker, not sure what Parker's first name is, as the kind of solid police detective foil. That kind of byplay is pleasant to read. The kind of homophobia that the plot involves or invokes, and the racism that the plot involves, and the descriptions just bubble up unnecessarily, is off-putting. I'm not sure what else I will be reading in the next week or so. I think I'm just going to take it day by day, and I hope you and the people you love are well, and that we all get through these next difficult weeks with as much grace and ease as we can. Take care of yourselves, take care of the people around you, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.